Science fiction is my favorite genre of all time. I came into it through Star Wars, and I have been reading it ever since. So, Star Wars really introduced me to all like the planets and the adventure, the wonder, all the different weird aliens and stuff. I thought it was the coolest thing ever, and so from there, I wanted more. So I dove into other books, other stories. I looked at Ender's Game. I looked at Dune, a bunch of things like that, and I fell in love with the science fiction genre, and I still love it today. I love every aspect of it. It's really interesting to me, which is why I started writing science fiction. I wrote Liar's Legacy when I was 17, and it was very much it's kind of a tribute to all those science fiction stories I grew up with. It's a space opera. It's very cheesy. It's got all that jazz. Then I've moved on to Fossil, the new Fossil trilogy, which I'm working on the second book right now. As sort of it was less of a love letter, more of just sort of my own addition to the science fiction genre, sort of my own story. So it's been a lot of fun, and I love the genre. There's so much you can do with it. It's infinite possibilities. But I've noticed a trend in modern sci-fi that I haven't really been enjoying as much. Um, a lot of old school sci-fi was very fun, very cheesy. It was very over the top. It was filled with so much adventure, so many interesting characters, and brilliant worlds, brilliant concepts. And that hasn't stopped. We still get a lot of really interesting concepts that are filled with story potential, and they're great. But they've the writers are limiting themselves. They've limited the use of these concepts because of certain rules and expectations they put upon themselves, if that makes sense. So we have no shortage of new and interesting ideas. It's just that we've started using those ideas to teach instead of to entertain and make people think. So we are just answering questions instead of asking them. And that's, I think, the biggest difference between sci-fi now versus sci-fi then. So, The Murderbot Diaries is a series of novellas by Martha Wells, and it has a very interesting idea. It's about a cyborg who learned that their cyborgs are used as kind of slaves in this world. And this cyborg is specifically a security bot, and it learns to, it gains consciousness and learns that it wants freedom, and that's kind of what the series is about. I read the first book and I didn't hate it, but I couldn't finish the second book. I barely got started in the second book, couldn't finish it. The problem is that it uses this outside perspective to look on humanity, which I thought was a really interesting way of using the concept, just using it as a way to view humanity from an outside viewpoint. But it used it in such a pessimistic way. Everything about humans was awful, and their society was bad, capitalism was bad, so everything was terrible. And I hated that. It was so frustrating. It's like I know it's a critique, and I know it's a social criticism, and I enjoy social criticism in fiction. There's no problem with that. It's just that it was so pessimistic and very negative. It didn't offer any solution. It just felt like the story was a way for the author to just complain. And that wasn't fun to me. The main character is very whiny, and I did not enjoy that. It was a very preachy sort of a story. There were a lot of fun action scenes, and it used some interesting concepts for those action scenes, and I enjoyed that. But the characters were pretty flat, and they were just used to, complain about society these days, and it wasn't fun to read. And other shows and series have sort of fallen into that trap where they're preaching more than they're asking questions. Like take Doctor Who for example. It's one of the greatest shows of all time. I love Doctor Who. I've started getting into the classic series recently. I haven't really gotten too far into it. I think I'm still on season 1, but the new Who, brilliant. Loved every second of it until you hit season 10, but we're getting there. So it was filled with a lot of interesting ideas. It was certainly more fantasy than it was sci-fi, but that's the kind of sci-fi that I enjoy. So it was again very positive, and it asked a lot of questions. Sure, it had social critique, but it didn't just complain. It offered solutions, and presented questions and offered different ideas that none of the answers to these questions were wrong specifically. Sometimes there were wrong answers, but there were usually a lot of different solutions to one problem. And some of the times there was no right answer. They were all bad choices, and that was interesting. That's what made the Doctor such an interesting character, because he was the one that had to bear the burden of making the decisions when there was no right answer. That was interesting. But now it's gotten to the point where the show is just so preachy, and it's not entertaining anymore. It's just social message after social message after social message. It was really just bogging down the story, and it just wasn't fun, and I didn't enjoy that, because it wasn't trying to entertain you anymore. It wasn't trying to be a fun show. It wasn't trying to be interesting. It was trying to teach, say, hey, this is how you're supposed to think now. This is how you're supposed to live your life. Do what we asked you to do. And that's not fun, you know? That's not what I go to Doctor Who for. I go to Doctor Who to have fun, wacky adventures, but also to think and to have, look at these moral dilemmas and think about what would I do in that situation. That's that is a big part of sci-fi, is the philosophy and the moral questions, rather than just teaching how you should think and what you should believe is right or wrong. And even Star Wars has fallen for this trap. Star Wars, which I was the biggest fan of Star Wars. I watched the movies, I watched the Clone Wars, I read a ton of books, I played a ton of games. My best friend in high school and we were huge Star Wars nerds, and I later found new other friends through my my love of Star Wars, and we played the games together. We had a ton of fun together, and we would talk about the books, we talk about the lore, a bunch of interesting stuff like that, and we loved it. But Star Wars has just it's gone way downhill. It's so preachy now, and it lost that wonder and that excitement and the adventure, because it's no longer about the conflict between good and evil within ourselves. It's about don't live this way, this bad, do this good. You know? It's not the same fantasy it was. It's again a very preachy story. The stories are just kind of, they're just trying to push a message. And it doesn't really matter what message it is. That's not what the story's job is. The story is there to entertain, and if the author so desires, to ask thought-provoking questions, which I find interesting. That's where you get things like Orson Scott Card, you get Philip K. Dick, all the classic science fiction authors, Isaac Asimov, things like that. Because they asked questions, and it provided multiple views and multiple answers, and you were kind of expected to think creatively and think critically and wonder what the right answer would be. It didn't give you a proper explanation of, this is the situation, here is the exact correct answer for this situation. It gave you ideas and dilemmas that you kind of had to decide for yourself, and it was interesting, and I enjoyed that. But Star Wars, it just lost that. It was never really, Star Wars was never really about the moral dilemmas, I suppose. It was more about the fantasy of it, and the heroism, and the positivity, and redemption, and family. But it's not really about that anymore. It's about either pushing an agenda, or it's about making money. One of those two. When it comes to the messaging, let's just take a look at The Rise of Skywalker. It's just about pushing all old ideas behind us and looking to the future. And, all old ideas are bad. Let's just destroy them and move on and figure things out for ourselves. But that's not positive. That's not interesting. What would be interesting is looking to the past, realizing their mistakes, and, you know, building off of that, saying, hey, it's okay that you did this bad thing, and you made mistakes, which led to this, but instead of putting that down and putting you down and saying, hey, you're awful for doing that, just try to learn from their mistakes and correct them. That's a more positive message that really encompasses the whole of Star Wars. It doesn't put anyone down. It doesn't put the legacy characters down. It doesn't put any of the fans down. It's uplifting. It's hopeful and it's inspiring. But we didn't get that. It was very, old things bad, good things new. New things good. Um, so it was really unfortunate in that regard. But in terms of just putting out content to make money, let's look at the Kenobi show, which I keep forgetting exists because I would rather it didn't. I kind of want to compare it to the Kenobi novel. The Kenobi novel was really interesting. It built off of, Kenobi as from episode 3. He's lost Anakin. He's stuck in a desert, and he feels this weight of responsibility of looking after Luke as Luke grows up because of what he's done. And he's not in a great place. And he's drawn into this conflict where he feels that he must interfere and he must be involved because, again, it's his responsibility. But it ends on a very hopeful message like, hey, maybe things aren't so bad. Like, sure, I screwed up, but like now I have this new task to work with. And it was interesting. The Kenobi show did not take that route. It did do some pretty interesting stuff. Pitting Kenobi against Vader again was pretty interesting, but it ultimately was just a cash grab. It didn't really have much of a message. It was just, a bunch of characters running around doing nothing, and ended up really being about one of the Inquisitor characters, which she wasn't even that interesting, so who cared, So it was a very frustrating show, and it was just there to push content onto Disney Plus, which was even more frustrating. Science fiction has just kind of become a way for people to complain about society. It's become more about social critique and about whining than it is about telling interesting stories. At least the ones that I've seen so far that are, modern and new. I haven't seen a lot of modern sci-fi that I've been interested in. It's all just it's nonsense and it's frustrating. And the ones that actually are trying to do recreate that wonder and that fantasy from old school Star Wars, old school sci-fi, things like Rebel Moon, just drop the ball and they're written terribly. And it's not a great time to be a sci-fi fan. It used to be a genre of just positivity and hope and adventure, but now it's become so pessimistic and so negative and very, very preachy that it's not fun to read or watch anymore. And I enjoy the old sci-fi books. I still read a lot of the old sci-fi, but it just feels like the more sci-fi most sci-fi that's put out these days is just very, very preachy, and it's not entertaining, and they don't try to be entertaining. They're just trying to push, their message and complain about society without offering any solutions. So, what if we stopped writing about dystopias all the time and started writing about some utopias? What happened to endless possibilities? What happened to exploring? What happened to going where no man has gone before? We've seen so many stories where everything's terrible in the future. Humanity is bad, everyone's greedy, and everyone hates each other. And there's no hope in that. So why don't we just start writing stories where there is hope? Humanity has kind of come together in the future to create a society that is uplifting and looking toward the future, trying to explore, things like that. It should be about discovery. It should be about exploration, and it should be positive stories instead of all this negative junk that we're getting. So, sci-fi authors, let's change that. You know, we are the next voices coming up. We are the new voices in science fiction literature, and people will be looking to us for their science fiction stories. So let's give them something to look for. Let's give them something to enjoy instead of making them have to go back and read old stories to get anything good. There's nothing wrong with the old stories. I love the old stories. Dune is one of my favorite novels of all time. A Princess of Mars is filled with so much wonder and it's so interesting. But let's create some new stuff. Let's create some new positivity. Let's let's bring hope back into the world. Let's make science fiction a beacon of hope and positivity instead of negative, pessimistic preachy and all that. Let's ask questions and don't try to tell people what the right answer is. So that's just my thoughts on sci-fi as it is right now. I have links down below. One is for my books where you can pick up my science fiction stories that are a bit more positive, and you can also pick up or look at my newsletter, which I kind of talk about more about writing. I talk about my progress on writing. I'll share some short stories time again, or from time to time. I can't talk today, but so check those out, and I hope to see you guys next time. Let me know your thoughts. What do you think about science fiction as it is right now? What do you think about science fiction as it was? What do you think the difference is? How do you think it's changed? Do you like science fiction now? Do you like science fiction then? Which do you prefer? I enjoy talking to you guys. I enjoy replying to y'all's comments. So just let me know, and I'll see you there. Y'all take care.